Hi, I'm Rich Caruana, a researcher at Microsoft Research in Redmond. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to talk to you today. And what we're going to talk about is the risk of using black box models in healthcare and the importance of intelligibility, being able to see exactly what your models have learned before you deploy them and use them clinically. Before I start, I'd like to thank a number of people who have worked with me on this over the years. In particular, 5 great grad students, Yin Liu, Sarah Tan, Shuzhou Zhang, Ben Langridge, and Kingsley Chang. A number of developers at Microsoft who have helped build the package that we're going to use. And then a number of collaborators from universities and hospitals who have worked with us over the years on this project. Here's how I got involved in this. Back when I was a grad student at Carnegie Mellon in the mid-90s, I got asked to train a machine learning model on a pneumonia risk problem. And the goal is not to predict if you have pneumonia or not. We already know all the patients have pneumonia. The goal is to determine which patients are high risk or low risk. If you're low risk, the safest treatment for you as a pneumonia patient really is as an outpatient. You know, antibiotics, chicken soup, and call us in a few days if you're not feeling better. That really is the best treatment for a low risk pneumonia patient. Being in the hospital is a dangerous place to be if you don't have to be there. However, if you're high risk, and about 10% of the patients in the data set do die from pneumonia, so pneumonia can be very high risk for some patients, then you absolutely should be admitted to the hospital, possibly even the ICU. Now, I got lucky. The neural net that I trained on this data set was the most accurate model anyone could train on this particular data. And there were many different teams, even at different universities, who are working with the same data set. So the neural net turned out to be the most accurate model. And the question arose, is it safe to use this neural net on real patients? Should we try using it clinically? And I thought about it for a few minutes and decided, no, actually, I don't think we should use this neural net on real patients. And that's because we didn't really understand it. And part of what concerned me was that another grad student working with the same data set at another university who was doing rule-based learning, which was much more common back in the 90s, learned this rule a year earlier, which was that if you have a history of asthma, it lowers your chance of dying from pneumonia. That is, asthma looks like it's good for you if you've got pneumonia. It looks like it's protective. You don't have to know a lot of healthcare to question whether asthma could really be good for you if you have a respiratory infection like pneumonia. So we went and asked the doctors about this. And the doctor said, oh, absolutely, asthmatics are higher risk. You have to fix your models, however you do that, so that they do not predict that asthmatics are lower risk. But they told us it's probably a true pattern in the data. And their explanation is something like this. You know, asthmatics are paying attention to their breathing. They might notice the symptoms of pneumonia earlier than other people. They might have a med like an inhaler that they try. It doesn't work because it's not designed to work for pneumonia. So they have a doctor who treats their asthma. They call the doctor. The doctor says, oh, the inhaler didn't work. Get in here. So they get an early appointment in healthcare. The doctor hopefully recognizes that they've got pneumonia, and then the doctor thinks that the patient is actually high risk because of their history of asthma, and the doctor ends up giving them very aggressive treatment, which might even include admission to a hospital or an ICU. And it's this combination of very rapid treatment, getting to care quickly, combined with very high quality aggressive treatment that actually does make the pneumonia patients be lower risk than regular patients like us who don't have asthma and might not get to care as quickly and might not get as aggressive care. Now, you might think that this is the problem that I'm most worried about in the neural net, is this asthma problem. Now, I assume the neural net, learned this asthma problem, and it's in the neural net somewhere in its, 10 million weights, because it's a real pattern in the data set. But this is not what we were worried about. Once we know that there's a problem like this, we're all pretty smart people, good engineers. We can figure out a way to make this problem in the neural net go away. Our concern was, what other risky bad things like this might the neural net have learned, hidden in its 10 million weights, that a rule-based system didn't learn the pattern and tell us that we have other problems in the neural net that we need to solve before it's safe to use this model clinically. So it's these sort of unknown unknowns, these landmines that might be hiding in the neural net that we don't know about, and we therefore don't know that we need to fix them. That really was the reason why we decided not to use the neural net. Okay, before I talk to you, this now has launched an entire research area for me that has lasted 10 years so far. Before we talk about, though, I just want to talk about this problem a little bit more. This is a fundamental problem in all data sets. Every one of your data sets has this kind of problem in it. I guarantee it. And that's because now that we have interpretable machine learning, we see it everywhere. No data set is immune to this. And it's a very simple problem that statisticians have understood for many, many decades. It's confounding. It's statistical confounding. What's happening is you're missing important features in the data set. In this case, things like time to care and quality of care. And because of that, features that are in the data set are acting as proxies for these missing features. And the proxy effect is that this feature, like asthma, can flip them being bad for you to being good for you because it's strongly correlated with getting to care quickly and getting high quality care, two things which are good for you. This is ubiquitous. You will always have important features that are missing in your data. You can't just assume that you'll always be able to get all the features you want. And to drive home this point, realize that even features that are not discovered yet can cause this kind of confounding. For example, our genome is not in most of our medical records at this point, and yet we all believe our genes are very, very important for our individual healthcare. Well, the fact that the data doesn't include information about your genes means that what it's learning about other clinical features that we do measure, say in a doctor's office or in the hospital, it means that what it's learning about those things is not quite right because it's not able to take into effect the confounding caused by the missing features, your genes. Now, how does healthcare get away from this? If you're always going to be missing features, how have we been doing healthcare for a century? Well, a lot of doctors believe in information most when it comes from a randomized clinical trial. So what's an RCT? That means that we've intentionally flipped a coin and decided to give treatment A or treatment B, or withhold treatment, give treatment, something like that, based on just randomization. And when we do that, we have a much better chance of seeing what the true impact is of the treatment that we give or the other treatment we give or withhold. So RCTs are like the gold standard in healthcare. The problem is the vast majority of healthcare data does not come from randomized clinical trials. So you might think, oh, well, that's the problem. Just go do randomized clinical trials. Well, we already know how to treat asthma and pneumonia effectively. We are not going to do a randomized clinical trial to randomize the care that we give to asthmatics who have pneumonia, like give some of them rapid care, some of them more aggressive care. We're not going to do that experiment because it's not ethical. We are not going to withhold treatment that we already know how to give that's effective for patients just to sort of train a more accurate neural net. So we're not going to do that. You will never be allowed to do that RCT. And because you can't do that RCT, you're just going to have to live with the data that you've got. And that means you're going to have to live with statistical confounding and these proxy effects. And I'm going to show you lots of examples. They're everywhere in your data sets. I guarantee it. And some of these, because of what the model learns from the confounding, some of these can be very risky when the model makes predictions. Okay, you might think, well, you really should just look at your data well enough and you'll discover these proxy effects. It turns out finding these things in data is quite difficult. And it's going to be easier, as I'm going to show you today, it's going to be easier to train a model and then understand what the model has learned and decide whether you need to correct that model or not. So it's surprisingly, it's going to be easier to do this with an accurate model than it's going to be to do it from the raw data. I'm not going to have time to talk about this, but this asthma is acting as a bias, essentially, in our pneumonia data set. And the kinds of methods that we're going to talk about to recognize and then mitigate these biases also work for other kinds of bias that we're interested in, things like race, gender, and socioeconomic bias. So the problem is that there are real statistics, in the data, in the training signals. It's really not usually a problem with the learning algorithm. The problem is with the data. And it's going to turn out that the methods we're going to use to detect these sorts of proxy effects will also enable us to detect things like race and gender bias and mitigate those. But sadly, we won't have time to talk about that. Definitely get in touch with me if you're more interested in that aspect of interpretable modeling. Okay, all we would need to solve this problem would be a model as accurate as that neural net that we wanted to use clinically, but is interpretable as, say, rules or simple models like linear and logistic regression. But you might have heard that there's a trade-off, that the most accurate models, things like boosted trees, random forests, and neural nets, are just not very interpretable. They're black box models. And more glass box models, things that are easy to interpret, like logistic regression, a naive Bayes, linear regression, a very simple, small decision tree. These things are interpretable. They're easy enough for us to understand, but unfortunately, they're not as accurate as we would like on complex data sets. This is usually not true anymore. That's great news. If you're working with tabular data, it turns out that we now have models that are as accurate as these black box models, and yet as interpretable as these glass box models. And that's what we're going to talk about today. These EBM stands for explainable boosting machines. This is a glass box learning method. That's what we're going to use now to sort of train models in healthcare, that we can understand how the model works exactly, and if necessary, even correct the model. And you'll see there are many times when we need to correct these models before it's safe to use them clinically. I just want to show you that this trade-off, really big trade-off between accuracy and intelligibility really is sort of over now for tabular data. So here's an experiment. Now be careful, I'm a co-author on this, so take the results with a grain of salt. But here's an experiment where EBMs on 10 different data sets, this is AUC, and the average AUC is 0.866 on the left here. And on the far right, we have full complexity models. So this is things like deep random forest, gradient boosting trees, which have been optimized to perfect depth. In this case, depth 3 is best on these data sets. And notice that the average accuracy across the data sets is also 0.866. That means that these glass box EBMs on the left have matched the accuracy on average of gradient boosted trees on these 10 data sets, and are actually slightly outperforming random forests, which is great. Now, this is an experiment conducted by Cynthia Rudin and her students, so we're not involved in this work. And they're comparing different glass box methods, of which EBMs is one of them. They're using our open source package. And the little red arrows at the top are pointing to the bars that represent EBMs. And it turns out across the dozen experiments they've done, it turns out that EBMs are the best model in sort of 9 out of 12 of the experiments, and they're second best in 2 out of 12. So they are the best performing overall glass box model. And they observed in this paper that the best interpretable models, which in this case happens to be EBMs, perform about as well as the best black box models. For example, they compared to XGBoost, and we were doing about as well as XGBoost. So that's great. And I just want to mention, we're starting to do experiments where we now know how to get neural nets to train these glass box models as well. And these NAMs are neural additive models, and EBMs are the explainable boosting machines we'll talk about today. And if you look carefully across the 3 classification data sets at the top and the 2 regression data sets at the bottom, you'll see that basically the neural net GAMs and the explainable boosting machines are sort of neck and neck. They're very similar accuracy. Okay, so the take-home message from those last 3 slides is that you no longer have to worry about this trade-off between accuracy and intelligibility if you're working with tabular data, data where the columns, have headings that mean something to you, like blood pressure, age, things like that. Okay, so that's great news. It means you can have your cake and eat it too, right? You can have high accuracy and absolute, fully accurate intelligibility at the same time. And then for free, you're also going to get editability. So that's wonderful. Now, these EBMs we're talking about are a type of what's known as generalized additive model, okay, GAMs. I want to be careful. We didn't invent these GAMs. I'll tell you about that in a second. But let me explain to you what they are first. Okay, so here's a linear model at the top, right? It's an intercept plus a weight times a feature, weight times a feature. That's a linear model. Easy to understand because if the weight is large positive, that means when the feature gets larger, it adds a lot to risk. If it's large negative, it subtracts a lot from risk. If it's near zero, it's probably not a very important feature. At the bottom is full complexity models. This is an arbitrarily complex function of all the available features. Whereas notice that this function is a linear function of each individual feature. There is something in between this, and that's additive models. So this is a function of feature one plus another function of feature two, another function of the last feature. And linear models are a special case of this where the function must be linear, just multiplied by a weight. But these can be much more complex functions. These can be nonlinear functions, multimodal functions. These are a much richer model class than the class of linear functions. Now we can make this class even richer. Notice that this class is only a function of one feature plus another function of another feature. We can go beyond that. So here's the sum of functions of single features. That's the line above. But now we have pairwise interactions. Here's a sum of functions of pairs of features. This can now model pairwise interactions. We can go further. Here's a sum of functions of triples of features. This is three-way interactions. And what we're going to do is we're going to restrict ourselves to main effects, functions of individual features, and then a small number of the most important pairwise interactions. And this is what's known as a generalized additive model with pairwise interactions. We didn't invent these, as I said. Statisticians, Trevor Hastie and Rob Tibshirani invented these at Stanford in the late 80s. So these predate a lot of machine learning. They've been around a long time. However, they were very conservative when they fit these models, and they used very smooth splines to fit these models. And because of that, they actually got less accuracy and also less intelligibility out of the models. It turns out being too smooth hurts intelligibility as well as accuracy. Now, we can't be too hard on the statisticians, right? This is the late 80s. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have all the computer horsepower. They didn't have large data sets. Most of machine learning hadn't happened yet, so they didn't have all the new tricks that we've got at our disposal. So they actually did a really good job. And by the way, they invented these things for exactly the reasons we want to use them, to make an accurate model, more accurate than linear models, but which was fully interpretable. They really, did a great service to the world by inventing these things. Our contribution is that we're going to put these models, these GAMs, on modern machine learning steroids. And that means we're not going to fit them as conservatively as they were fit in the 80s and 90s. And because of that, we're going to get higher accuracy. We're also, interestingly, going to improve the intelligibility. And for free, we're going to get the ability to edit these models, which is great. And we've released an easy-to-use open source package that you can use to train these models yourself. Okay, I'm going to skip the sketch of the algorithm for now. Maybe if there's time at the end, I'll go through it, but there's a good chance I won't have time to do that. If you're interested though, please get in touch with me and I'm happy to tell you more about this. So I'm going to jump right in now. Remember that pneumonia problem from the mid-90s is what motivated my interest in intelligible machine learning. So let's jump in, and I'm going to use that as an example to get started, and then we'll go through a few more medical case studies more quickly after that. So this data set had 46 features. The data was collected in 1989. There's about 15,000 patients. And we know things about the patient's history, their age, their gender, if they have cancer or not, if they have asthma. They've all had a physical exam, so we know their blood pressure and their heart rate and respiration rate. We know what their breathing sounds like. They've all had blood tests, so we have some lab findings for these people. And they've all had a chest x-ray. We wouldn't normally use the chest x-ray now to diagnose most pneumonias, but back then it was the gold standard. So they've all had chest x-rays, and we have doctor's notes from the chest x-ray. So, and remember, this model is a function of a feature plus a function of a feature. So what we're going to do is we're going to have 46 functions, one for each of these features, and then we're going to throw in 10 pairwise interactions. So in the end, we're going to end up with 56 functions. So let me show you what that looks like at a high level. Here's a function of risk as a function of age, as a function of asthma, as a function at the bottom of your blood urea nitrogen. And the way you use the model is you look up the patient's age on the x-axis, read the contribution to risk on the y-axis, that's a log odd score, and then you write it down. In this case, mine is 0.23. Go to the next feature, the next graph, the next function, find out where the patient falls in that graph, write down the score. You do this for all 56 scores. You're going to add them up. The more positive the score, the higher the risk. The more negative the score, the lower the risk. So, and it's just like logistic regression. To convert this to a classification probability, the probability of death in this case would just be 1 over 1 plus e to the minus score, whatever the sum of these 56 numbers in. By the way, this is exactly the same as linear and logistic regression. So if this was logistic regression, up here in this exponent would be the intercept plus beta 1 times x1 plus beta 2 times x2. And all of these graphs, you could draw them if you wanted, but they would all look like straight lines, okay, because they have to be linear. But what we're going to do is we're going to use the score is going to come from these nonlinear, potentially multimodal graphs. So now we're going to have a sum of graphs sitting up here in the exponent, and that's going to represent the sum of the scores that come from each of these graphs added together. And maybe a patient has a sum of scores equal to minus 0.78. Everything below 0 has risk that's less than 50%. If you're above 0, it's risk above 50%. And this minus 0.78, this is still pretty high risk. This corresponds to a risk of about a 30% probability of death, which actually is very high for pneumonia. You really want to be a -2 or a -3 or a -4 on this kind of log scale. So let me jump in now and let's look at this one graph. This is risk as a function of age. And we're going to spend a little time on this graph. So risk is on the vertical axis. The patient's age is on the x-axis. You had to be an adult to be in this data set, so it starts at 18. The bottom is a histogram of our distribution of patients. And most of the patients are between, say, 60 and 90, but there are some younger patients and a few older patients. Let's read the top graph. So, well, it looks like it's good to be young. So, and everyone below 50 seems to be equally low risk. The model could distinguish between people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s if it felt it needed to, but it doesn't. So the risk is pretty flat there. Then risk goes up slowly as you go through your 50s into your 60s. Then there's a more rapid rise in risk happening around 67, 68, 69. We're almost certain that this is due to retirement. And then risk continues to climb pretty rapidly as you go through your 70s into your 80s, basically as you become elderly. I think that's to be expected. Surprising step function rise in risk at 85, surprising flatness in risk in the upper 80s and 90s, and then an even more surprising drop in risk that's happening at about 100, 101. So why this rise in risk at 85? Well, what doctors tell us is that, this is a data set from 1989, the average life expectancy is probably around 80 years for the population that this data set came from. And people who are over 85 are really on the elderly side of elderly. And what we think is happening is that patients who are over 85 are getting less aggressive treatment than patients under 85. And that's because they're so elderly. And notice that this is happening at a very round number. Doctors often use round numbers to make these sorts of decisions. There's nothing written in healthcare policy or insurance policy that says to treat patients over 85 differently than patients under 85, but we think that's what's happening. And the story is something like, well, you know, grandpa's 86. Grandpa has a number of illnesses associated with being elderly. In fact, because of those illnesses, that's why grandpa now has pneumonia. We're not so sure that it makes sense to continue fighting aggressively to save grandpa. These other illnesses are serious. And perhaps, you know, grandpa's time has come and we should not go for, you know, yet a third round of antibiotics. Maybe we're not doing grandpa any favors. And back then in the 80s and 90s, pneumonia was sometimes called the old man's best friend. The idea being that you have the illnesses associated with being elderly, and maybe you're going to sort of slowly waste away over the next few months or perhaps next year or so. And then at some point you're sick enough, you get pneumonia, and then pneumonia takes you out in a week or two. And perhaps that was a friendlier way to pass than lingering illnesses. Now, pneumonia is actually not a friendly way to pass. So we don't use that phrase anymore. We no longer consider pneumonia, you know, anyone's best friend. But we think this is the explanation for why there's this step function rise in risk right at this round number of 85. Now, the flatness we think is just due to people who have good genes. They've made it this far. They don't have other illnesses. And perhaps a patient who's otherwise very healthy and has good genes at age 95 is no higher risk than a patient at age 90 from pneumonia. So that would be one possible explanation for this flatness. The drop in risk at 100, 101 is really interesting. We think it is a social effect, just like the rise in risk at 85. 100 is a really, really round number, and it's a really significant number for human longevity, right? When a person has made it to 100, they're a centenarian. That's an incredibly rare thing. So we think what is happening is pneumonia is, after all, a treatable illness. If you want to give that third, fourth round of antibiotics, you can do it. If you want to intubate, you can do it. If you really think you should. We think what doctors are doing is you've got a patient who's made it to 100, 101, and you just don't want to give up on this patient. They're a centenarian. The patient might not want you to give up. The children, the grandchildren might not want you to give up. The doctors don't want to give up. And we think what's happening is that basically this extra aggressive treatment that doctors are willing to give for patients who have made it to the magic age of 100 plus is what causes this step function drop in risk. Okay, let's back off for a second. I've now told you some stories about what we think this model is telling us about risk as a function of age. First of all, this graph for risk as a function of age is learned in parallel with all the other graphs. So this is not marginalization. This actually is a more complex model where what's learned on every graph takes into account what's learned on every other graph. The other thing is, it turns out this generalized additive model, which is 56 graphs, I'll only show you a few of them. It turns out it's actually more accurate than the neural net by a tiny bit, by epsilon. This is the most accurate model we know how to train on this data set, which is really amazing if you think about it. That a model that's this interpretable, where we can tell this sort of nuanced story. There's not much difference between being 20, 30, and 40. It's not too bad to be 50s and 60s. Retirement, interestingly, looked like it can be bad for you, at least in the United States, when a lot of things change when you retire, like your healthcare provider, your insurance provider, and stuff like that. Of course, old age sucks. Going into your 70s and 80s is not good for your health. Being over 85 conveys some extra added risk, but being over 100 sort of conveys a reduction in risk. That story is 100% accurate explanation of how this model works, because the model really is a series of 56 graphs like this. So the graphs are exactly how this model works. This is not an explanation of some more complex big model in the other room. This is the real model, is these graphs. And millions of boosted trees are trained in order to create these graphs, but then we throw the trees away and we keep the graphs, not the trees. Now, how many of you think that being over 100, being 105 is actually healthier than being 95? Doesn't kind of make sense. This kind of model, it turns out we can edit it. If we redraw this part of the graph so that it's a monotone increasing risk, then it turns out the model will do exactly what we tell it to do. And now this drop in risk that it would predict over 100 will go away. So that's amazing that we can now fix this model when we think it has learned something that's statistically true, but which we don't want the model to do when we're using it clinically. So that's amazing. By the way, the accuracy on the test set will go down slightly when we do this. And that's because the test set has the same kind of statistics as the training set. So the test set also sees that people over 100, 101 are a little bit lower risk. So now when we make the model not predict lower risk for those patients, hey, for those patients in the test set who are over 100, the model will be a slightly less accurate predictor. However, we believe it will be a safer predictor. We will believe it will be a more correct predictor. We actually don't trust the test set to tell us the truth. We trust this monotone increase in risk more than what the test set is telling us. And that's because we can explain away why the test set learns that people over 100 are lower risk. And we think it's because they get extra aggressive treatment. We wouldn't want the model to predict that they're lower risk, because then they might not get the aggressive treatment and then they wouldn't be lower risk. So it's really safer for us to predict that they're higher risk. Okay. Now, would you always want to do this kind of edit? Not necessarily. Suppose you're an insurance company who just wants to know what patients are likely to live or die from their current illness. Well, you're not going to intervene, hopefully, in their health care. You're not going to use this model to change their treatment. So that means you might just be interested in knowing that, in fact, patients who are 105 are a little more likely to survive than patients who are 95. Or maybe you don't even care about the explanation and you just want to use a black box. But I think insurance companies would be interested in better understanding survival statistics for the patients that they provide provide medical insurance for. Number one most important lesson that this tells us is that accuracy is not the true north. We're actually going to accept small losses in accuracy often when we edit the model, because we believe that will make the model more accurate in the real world, even though it might be a little less accurate on the test set. And that's because the test set looks like our training set and has the very same defects that are in our training set are usually sitting in our test set. Okay, so that's very, very important. Highest accuracy is not what you should be going for. You should be going for correctness. And to know what's correct or not, you have to know how the predictions coming from the model will be used. Correctness is different whether you're an insurance company or whether you're going to use this to make treatment decisions or admission to the hospital decisions. Let me show you a few fun things the model has learned. Well, first of all, there are many jumps at round numbers, and those are almost always going to be due to human social policy effects. Okay, so there are many jumps in round numbers. I'll show you a few more of them. The model learns that asthma lowers risk. Remember, that's where we started. The asthmatics are on the right and risk goes down. We expected that. We were actually hoping the model would learn that because we think it's a true statistic in the data that we're going to now need to fix. However, the model also learns that having a history of chest pain and a history of heart disease are good for you. In fact, they're better for you than having asthma. That doesn't seem to make sense. We think the explanation is kind of similar. Maybe you have a history of heart disease, or you even had a heart attack a few years ago. You've got pneumonia, your chest feels a little bit funny. There's a good chance you're afraid you might be having a heart attack. And what you'll do is you'll get in an ambulance and go to the emergency room immediately if that happens. So you'll actually get to care very, very quickly. And they'll know right away after they put electrical probes on your chest, you're not having a heart attack. And then hopefully they'll diagnose you have pneumonia. And because you have a history of heart disease, they're going to consider you higher risk, and you're going to get really high quality care because you're right there in the emergency room. Okay, so that's why having heart disease and chest pain looks like it's good for you. Turns out having stridor might be good for you as well. Stridor is a kind of wheezing, which indicates that one of your airways is blocked. How could that possibly be good for you? It's actually a sign of advanced pneumonia. The reason why that can be good for you is because it's a symptom you can't ignore. Your breathing sounds so terrible, you know you have to go to the hospital. And anyone in the room with you knows that you have to go to the hospital. And they'll stop the meeting and say, look, I'll take you to the hospital now. You really need to go. And there's nothing more important if you have a treatable illness than having a symptom which happens early in the illness, and which is unignorable, something that you will absolutely respond to, because then you'll get treatment. Now, we don't want the model to predict that asthma is good for you, heart disease is good for you, and stridor is good for you, even though it's statistically true in the data. So one of the things we can do is we can edit these things to just flatten the graphs. Now the model will not predict that asthmatics are higher or lower risk than other patients. Or we can actually say, no, asthmatics actually add 0.38 to the risk. Heart disease patients add 0.6. Stridor patients who are very sick add 0.8. If a doctor wants us to, we can actually add risk to patients as opposed to what the model learned to do, which was subtract risk for these patients. So that's great. But here's a really crazy thing. If you don't edit the models, so remember, these are what the original models look like. This model, it's an additive model. It predicts that a patient who's 105 years old with a history of asthma, who also has a history of chest pain and heart disease, who now has an obstructed lungway and they have stridor, is actually very low risk, right? Because all these things add to lower risk if you don't fix them. That is terrible. That's an incredibly risky thing for a model to do. So you can see how important it is for us to be able to fix these things. Okay. Not only is it risky, but the model is rewarded, remember, with extra high accuracy on the test set for making these predictions. And that's because the test set looks like a random sample of our training set. So the same statistics apply there. So this just reinforces that accuracy is not your true north. Correctness is your true north. And now that you have interpretability, if you work with experts like doctors, you can get the model closer to correct. And maybe the accuracy will suffer a little in the third decimal place, but the model will be more correct and safer to deploy. Good thing we didn't use that neural net back in the mid-90s. Remember, we were scared of using it because it probably learned all of these same things too. But with this kind of model, we can find these things in the model. We can see what it's learned. And when an expert tells us we should edit the model, we really can fix the model as well. This transparent modeling, this glass box modeling, it's like having a new pair of glasses when in the past you used to be blind. It really is a remarkable thing. By the way, you might think that we could fix these problems by just removing features like asthma or heart disease from the model. Turns out that doesn't work. The bias is coming in the training signals, the fact that the asthmatic and heart disease patients actually do have a higher probability of survival. So it turns out that that's where the bias is coming from, not the input features. The input features are just statements of fact. And if you remove the input features because of correlation that the feature you removed had with other features that are still in the model will do everything it can to learn to be biased. And it'll do it in a way that'll now be more complex to understand. It's exactly like trying to remove race bias by removing an input feature, which is whether a person is Black, white, or Hispanic from the input of the model. We all know that other features that you might leave in the model, like zip code, education, income, will leak a lot of information about race into the model through the inputs. And then the bias is really in the outputs that you're using to train the model. So you don't want to remove features. In fact, you want to do the opposite. Take the features you're most afraid of the model learning the wrong thing about, include them in the model, let it learn those wrong things focused on those features. And now it's kind of like the tumor is localized, and you're more able to surgically edit, remove the tumor because it hasn't spread throughout the model. So I want to, I've been telling you some things that models learn that are bad that you might need to fix. Let me show you a beautiful thing that these models can also tell us. This is your risk of dying from pneumonia as a function of your blood urea nitrogen. This is a blood test all of us have had. Doctors really like this graph. Risk is low for low BUN, and then it starts to rise around 30, 35. Notice it flattens right at 50. That's because at 50, doctors start to give a medication, and that medication is effective at lowering risk. So in fact, the risk peaks sort of here at 50 and then flattens off because of the med. And then eventually high BUN causes the risk to go up again. Notice it peaks right at 100. Notice these are round numbers, 50 and 100. And then risk actually goes down. Well, at about 100, they start considering using dialysis. And by the time you get to 110 or 120, all the patients who are eligible for dialysis are probably getting it. And that's why the risk actually goes down, because most of the patients here are getting dialysis, whereas only some of the patients at 100 are getting dialysis. Here's the interesting thing. Doctors immediately question, so these are treatment effects, by the way, and there are lots of treatment effects because almost all of our patients are being treated when we collect data on them. So doctors love the fact that they could see the effect of their treatments, the benefit of them in these data sets. But they also started to wonder, wow, risk is pretty high at 35. Maybe I should give this med if it's safe for patients at 35 or 40, not wait until 50. And especially this one, maybe I should not be waiting to 100 to give dialysis. Maybe I should be giving dialysis at 85 or 90. And with this sort of model, we can do a conservative estimate of what would happen if the treatment threshold for 100 got moved down to say 85. And we conservatively estimate that the new risk curve, if we were able to do this, would look like this red line. Actually, we think it would look lower than the red line. So this is a conservative estimate. And we think that we would see lower risk in this region, perhaps in this region as well, we're not sure. And then the area between the red line and the original curve is mortality. So this reflects lives saved. And our estimate is that in the United States alone, in 1 year, by just changing this one treatment threshold for dialysis, for just one illness, pneumonia, we can save 2,500 or more lives just in the United States. So this sort of learning that we can do when we try to understand a model trained on our data that we've collected in healthcare can really tell us things about healthcare that we did not know and can suggest ways that we might want to improve healthcare. So that's just wonderful. Treatment effects are all over. This is systolic blood pressure. Good blood pressure is here. This is too low. This is getting too high. Notice these bumps happen around 175, 200, 225. Those are all round numbers. We see lots of treatment effects happening at round numbers. Let me show you what a pairwise interaction is. This is risk as a function of age. This is risk as a function of cancer. Having cancer does add to your risk. And pairwise interactions are things which can't be explained as a sum of a risk from this graph plus a risk of this graph. You really have to consider both of the features together. So here's the interaction. So here's cancer on the x-axis and age on the vertical axis. And I want to draw your attention to this bright yellow region and orange region at the bottom of the youngest patients who have cancer. That is adding a lot, like 0.3 to 0.5 to their risk, in addition to the risk that they got from the previous graphs. And it turns out we believe that the explanation for this, I mean, young patients are usually low risk. Why would they be extra high risk? We think the explanation for this is that young cancer patients are given very aggressive treatment for their cancer, more aggressive treatment than elderly patients are given. And that's because the young patients can survive the treatment. And when we give that kind of treatment to the young patients, unfortunately, we also knock out their immune system. And if they have pneumonia, they have to have pneumonia or they wouldn't be in this data set. It turns out they're now at higher risk of dying from pneumonia because their immune system has been knocked out. So it's kind of a sad story, but the model has completely automatically figured out that it should tell us that there is a special group of relatively young patients, 18 to let's say 40 or 50, who surprisingly are at elevated risk from pneumonia as opposed to reduced risk, as you would expect. So that's a pairwise interaction. There are 10 of them in the model, and all of them are interesting. Let me show you, this is a different data set, mimic ICU data set. This is a PF ratio. It's how well you're breathing. People who are breathing well are out here around 1,000. They have low PF ratio. High PF ratio, patients who are out near 0 to like a couple hundred, that's bad. They're having a lot of trouble breathing, and the model's adding a lot to their risk. What's interesting is what's this crazy drop in risk that's happening right at this part of the graph? What is going on there? We wondered if it was a round number. It turns out it's not a round number, and it's not a round number in metric units either. So it's just not a round number effect. We started investigating, well, what's the mean of this feature? And it turns out the mean falls exactly here. That's a strong clue. And it turns out the data set before we got it had the missing values, of which 55% of these patients are missing their PF ratio. And that's because there's a very simple pinch test that tells you what a person's PF ratio is. They're missing this value, and they were all imputed with the mean. And the mean, unfortunately, for the patients who weren't missing it, puts it in a reasonably unhealthy region. And the model is doing it, if you're missing this value, you're actually pretty healthy, at least with respect to breathing. What the model is doing is it's trying to jump way down in risk to being equal to what healthy people are out of 1,000, and then jump right back up to high risk. Now, you might think, well, this doesn't hurt the accuracy of the model too much. So once again, telling you that accuracy is not the thing you should be paying attention to, because obviously the model is incorrect here. The risky thing about leaving this uncorrected in the model is that there are some real patients with PF ratio falling right at the mean, and they're going to get predicted as having low risk, as opposed to having the high risk that they should be predicted as. So this is risky not for the healthy patients, it's risky for the unhealthy patients who are actually falling in this part of the graph. So we have to fix this sort of thing. There are lots of ways to fix it, including handling the missing values in a different way. I'm going to skip that, talk briefly about severe maternal morbidity. This is when something risky happens to the mother during delivery. Such as a hemorrhage, you need a blood transfusion, maybe the mother even needs a hysterectomy as a result of delivery. And if you ask a doctor, what they'll usually say is, well, maternal hypertension or maternal diabetes, high maternal age at time of delivery, high maternal body mass index are good candidates for risk factors. It turns out, though, those are not the most important risk factors. Once we trained an interpretable model on a real pneumonia SMM data set, what the model told us is two things are more important than those other things that doctors thought were most important. The first most important factor is the size of the baby. The larger the baby, the higher the risk. The second most important factor is the size of the mother. It turns out the taller the mother, on average, the larger the pelvic opening and birth canal, the larger the mother, the lower the risk. What this is telling us is that it's the physics of birth that actually conveys the most risk to the mother. If you're trying to have a large baby be born through a small pelvic opening, this is going to put a lot of stress and extra risk on the mother. However, if it's a small baby coming out of a large pelvic opening, then that will be lower risk. Okay, and this immediately led us, because it's the combination of these two things, that immediately led us to create a ratio of these things, which is the body mass index for pregnancy. So it's the baby's birth weight divided by the mother's height squared, because the height is the best measurement we had in this data set for pelvic opening. And this immediately becomes the single most important feature for predicting a severe maternal morbidity. So it's amazing, you know, within an hour of seeing the graphs for the model, we were creating this feature and knew it was going to be very important. And sure enough, it is. Let me talk briefly about COVID-19. This is risk as a function of age. COVID-19 is a respiratory illness like pneumonia. Somewhat similar results in some ways, you know, a lot of flatness in the region that's sort of 20 to 30 to 40, 50. Then risk goes up. We see bumps in some of the usual places, including a bump at 85. We see a very unusual high bump, you know, at around 95. And the reason why is this data set, two things are happening. One, we're not allowed to know a patient's age to protect their privacy if they're over 95. So they're all coded as 95. Also, many elderly patients would be put on do not intubate orders. And because of that, they're more likely to die because we're not going to intubate them. Intubation is a really aggressive treatment, and you have to be reasonably healthy, or else intubation itself is high risk for the patient. So this is somewhat similar to what we learned for pneumonia, except we see some novel effects here because of COVID-19 and the way it's treated. One thing that's interesting is the vertical scale is about 4 times larger on a log scale than what we saw for pneumonia. And that's really significant. COVID-19 is a much higher risk illness. Here's gender. So women are lower risk and men are higher risk, as we all read about in the newspapers in the early days. And this is a very serious effect. I've never seen one quite this large for a respiratory illness. A woman who's 75 and has certain comorbidities might be, let's say, 10% probability of death if she's in the hospital. The equivalent man with all the same features, same age, would be about 14% probability of death. So that really is a striking difference in probability of death between the two genders. This is really interesting. I've turned the graph sideways so you can read some of the features. These are the lowest features at the top and the high risk features at the bottom. I just want to say it's interesting that some of the lowest risk features are if you were taking platelet inhibitors prior to admission. Turns out these are anticoagulation meds, and dying of blood clots is one of the 2 principal ways of dying of COVID-19. So it turns out if you happen to have been taking anticoagulants for other reasons like heart disease before you came to the hospital with COVID-19, that's a good thing for you. And then these other things like proton pump inhibitors, we don't actually think this medication causes your risk to be higher. We think it's the illness associated with the fact that you need to take this medicine that actually causes you to be higher risk. So you do have to be careful. You can't just blindly interpret this graph as this med causes higher risk. We think it's the case that it's the illness associated with the med that actually causes the higher risk. This was our first discovery. Everyone knew that high lymphocytes was high risk. Your body's in massive infection fighting mode. The surprise was that low lymphocytes also could be a sign of extra high risk. And we now believe that the reason for this is because patients with very low lymphocytes are failing to launch an attack on COVID-19. And because of that, they're at extra high risk because their immune system is not launching a response. And then this is some work that Ben Lengerich and Yin and a few of us did. This is a really interesting finding. It basically says if your NLR ratio is in this fairly narrow range from, let's say, 6 to 12, then a glucocorticoid treatment, the pink thing, is an effective treatment. But it's not an effective treatment if you're healthier with an NLR ratio, say 0 to 5. And in fact, you probably should be using something else instead of glucocorticoid steroids. And that's really interesting. And it kind of matches our belief that there are multiple ways of dying from COVID-19. And the glucocorticoid steroid only fights one of those ways of dying, that is the cytokine storm, but it doesn't help you with blood clotting. And probably people of lower NLR should be getting treatment for blood clotting as opposed to for their cytokine storm. Really fascinating. I'll just do this really quickly and then we'll wrap up. So this is 30-day hospital readmission. One of the things we can do is we can look at the predictions for an individual patient. So instead of doing this sort of global analysis of what did the model learn, is it right, should we edit it, we can also look at predictions it makes for an individual patient. This model has 4,000 features in it, 4,000 graphs. No one human has ever seen all of these graphs. That's a lot of graphs. But here's a patient 75,412. Their sum of risk scores is 4.6. That's very high on a log scale. 92% probability of being readmitted in 30 days. The single most important feature is feature 139. They are getting IV fat emulsion. That is, they're having calories put into them through an IV. And that is adding a 0.45 to their risk. The second most important feature out of 4,000 is that they have cyclical vomiting syndrome, and that is adding 0.38 to their risk. They're getting amitriptyline. That's a medication that's anti-nausea med. That's adding 0.35 to their risk. They've been an inpatient 64 times. That's unbelievable. They define the right edge of this graph. That adds 0.32 to their risk. They've been an inpatient 18 times in the last 12 months. That adds another 0.3 to their risk. That's a lot of times to be an inpatient in 1 year. Obviously, their mean time between visit is less than 30 days. And then they've been an inpatient 10 times in the last 6 months. Okay, that's really interesting. Remember, we've only looked at 5 or 6 of 4,000 graphs, and we think we understand why the model predicts this patient is high risk. Here's another patient, patient 4, a typical patient. They have a typical probability of readmission, about 8 or 9%. The model says, well, they've been an inpatient 6 times, but that only adds 0.07 to their risk. They have an electrolyte imbalance that's very common. That adds another 0.07 to their risk. Oh, they have a code that says, they're having behaviors which are letting them, do things that are hazardous to the wrist, like riding their motorcycle at 150 miles an hour without a helmet, or possibly even things that might be viewed as being suicidal. So that's adding something to their risk, another 0.05. They've been in the ER 6 times. So all 6 of their hospital visits came through the ER. That's a riskier way to enter the hospital than for something scheduled. Oh, they have combat fatigue. That's adding to the risk. So now we know this is probably a vet. They have mild drug intoxication. So either they're using alcohol or some other drug, and that's adding 0.03 to the risk. Now think about it. We just looked at about a half a dozen graphs. This patient looks completely different from the other patient, and we only looked at the top 6 graphs. So it's amazing that we can use this model to understand exactly why the model is predicting that any one patient is high risk or low risk. Okay, now we're going to return and wrap up. I'm going to skip that. Just let me give you a summary. High accuracy on a test set absolutely is not sufficient to trust a model. Do not believe that the most accurate model is the safest model to use. It is usually misleading, this accuracy in these sort of critical domains. And remember, the model is rewarded with very high accuracy for doing very stupid, risky things. I've shown you a number of them in this presentation, and I guarantee they're happening in your data set. If you use an interpretable model, you will see these problems in your data set as well, and you'll be able to fix them. Retrospective test set analysis is always optimistic because the test data looks like your training data. The real world prospective analysis looks different from your training data. I guarantee it. And these treatment effects that we're seeing in the real world are in all medical data sets. And often we need to correct these in our model before deploying them. The high order bit is that data is always wrong in surprising ways, and you will not anticipate these things. So you really need some interpretable model, magic glasses, to be able to see the ways in which data cause your model to learn things that are not good. And these EBMs really give us a beautiful combination of high accuracy, intelligibility and explanation that's not even approximate, it's exact, and this editability, the ability to fix this model. And there's an open source package that you can use to train these models yourself. It's very easy to use. Don't think that removing the offending features will make this problem go away. That's just not true. And you really need intelligibility, transparency, and the ability to edit these models in order to use machine learning safely in healthcare.